World War II, fought between 1939 and 1945, was the deadliest and most widespread conflict in human history, engulfing more than 30 countries across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. Sparked by Germany's invasion of Poland, it quickly escalated as alliances drew the globe into a devastating struggle. The Axis powers, led by Germany, Italy, and Japan, sought territorial expansion and dominance, while the Allies, headed by Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and later the United States, fought desperately to resist and push back the tide of aggression. The war featured unprecedented levels of brutality. Entire cities were bombed into rubble, concentration camps systematically murdered millions, and for the first time, atomic bombs were unleashed on civilian populations. Landmark battles like Stalingrad, Midway, El Alamein, and D-Day demonstrated the enormous scale of global mobilization. Over 100 million people served in uniform, while civilians endured unimaginable suffering, from starvation and displacement to mass executions. Casualties exceeded 70 million, with the Holocaust alone claiming 6 million Jewish lives, alongside millions of others targeted by the Nazi regime. The Pacific Theater saw equally horrifying losses, from the firebombing of Tokyo to the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. World War II redrew international borders, created millions of refugees, and devastated economies across continents. The conflict birthed the United Nations in hopes of preventing another catastrophe, while leaving the United States and the Soviet Union as global superpowers, setting the stage for the Cold War. Its devastation redefined modern warfare, revolutionized technology, and left scars, physical, political, and emotional, that remain visible today. World War I, fought between 1914 and 1918, often called the Great War, began with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo, but quickly spiraled into a global conflict as alliances triggered cascading declarations of war. The Allies, including Britain, France, Russia, and later the United States, faced off against the Central Powers led by Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. It transformed how wars were fought, ushering in modern industrialized killing. The Western Front became infamous for trench warfare, where soldiers lived for months in mud, disease, and terror. Poison gas attacks, massive artillery bombardments, and machine guns caused death on a scale never before seen. Battles like Verdun and the Somme resulted in catastrophic casualties, hundreds of thousands dead or wounded for just a few miles of land. For the first time, civilians were heavily impacted by industrialized warfare, as blockades caused starvation and bombings reached beyond the battlefield. By war's end, more than 16 million lives were lost, and 20 million more were wounded. Ancient empires collapsed, including Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and the Russian monarchy. The map of Europe was redrawn, birthing new nations and stoking nationalist movements. Entire generations were scarred, with lost generations of young men wiped out in the trenches. Though hailed as the war to end all wars, its unresolved grievances, the harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles, and economic devastation planted the seeds for an even greater conflict just 2 decades later, World War II. The Napoleonic Wars, fought between 1803 and 1815, erupted in the wake of the French Revolution, fueled by Napoleon Bonaparte's rise to power and his ambition to dominate Europe. France, energized by revolutionary zeal and Napoleon's unmatched military talent, confronted coalitions of European powers in campaigns that swept from Spain and Italy to the plains of Central Europe and deep into Russia. Napoleon revolutionized warfare with speed, organization, and innovative corps-based tactics. Victories such as Austerlitz in 1805 and Jena Auerstedt in 1806 showcased his brilliance, yet his relentless ambition proved costly. The disastrous Russian campaign of 1812, marked by a brutal winter and staggering losses, marked the turning point in his fortunes. Guerrilla resistance in Spain and a resurgent coalition gradually eroded his dominance. The wars devastated much of Europe, claiming millions of lives and leaving economies shattered. Towns and cities were burned, farmland destroyed, and populations displaced. Politically, the conflicts ignited nationalism and liberal ideas, spreading the legacy of the French Revolution even as monarchies fought to contain them. Napoleon's final defeat at Waterloo in 1815 ended his reign, Yet the wars left an enduring legacy: modern statecraft, organized mass conscription, and military strategies that shaped the future of European conflict. The Napoleonic era demonstrated both the heights of human ambition and the devastation that unchecked conquest could unleash. The 30 Years' War, fought between 1618 and 1648, was one of the longest and most devastating conflicts in European history. It began with a religious spark in the Holy Roman Empire, when Protestant nobles revolted against Catholic rulers. But what started as a struggle over faith soon escalated into a continental conflict involving Spain, France, Sweden, and Austria. Religion blended with politics, and survival replaced ideals. The brutality of this war was almost unmatched. Mercenary armies plundered cities, spread famine, and brought disease wherever they marched. Civilians often paid the highest price, with entire villages wiped out. Some German states lost nearly a third of their populations, leaving scars that lasted for generations. Shifting alliances prolonged the carnage. France, a Catholic nation, even sided with Protestant powers to weaken its rivals. The war became less about God and more about power, territory, and influence. It consumed Europe for 3 decades, draining treasuries and tearing apart societies. The conflict ended with the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, a landmark peace settlement, but the cost was staggering. Millions dead, economies shattered, and Central Europe left in ruins. The war marked a turning point, shaping diplomacy for centuries to come. The Mongol conquests of the 13th century reshaped the world. Led first by Genghis Khan and later his descendants, the Mongols built the largest land empire in history, stretching from China to Eastern Europe. Their campaigns left behind both immense destruction and far-reaching legacies. The Mongols' key weapon was speed. Their cavalry could cover vast distances in days, striking before enemies could react. Combined with advanced siege techniques, psychological warfare, and ruthless discipline, the Mongols crushed kingdoms one after another. Entire cities like Baghdad and Kiev were left in ashes, but it wasn't just destruction. The Mongols also connected the world in unprecedented ways. They opened trade routes across Eurasia, enabling goods, ideas, and cultures to move from China to Europe. The Silk Road flourished under their rule, and innovations spread faster than ever before. Yet the cost of conquest was immense. Tens of millions died, empires collapsed, and once thriving centers of learning were reduced to rubble. The Mongol conquests remain one of history's most devastating campaigns, both feared for their brutality and remembered for their impact on global history. The Taiping Rebellion, fought between 1850 and 1864, was one of the bloodiest civil wars the world has ever seen. It erupted in China when Hong Xiuquan, claiming to be the brother of Jesus Christ, declared war against the ruling Qing dynasty. What began as a spiritual movement quickly grew into a massive uprising that engulfed much of southern China. The Taiping forces, driven by a radical vision of equality and religious zeal, captured major cities and even established their own capital in Nanjing. At their height, they commanded millions of followers and posed a direct threat to the Qing dynasty's survival. The conflict was marked by immense suffering. Entire provinces were ravaged, with massacres, starvation, and disease claiming lives on a horrific scale. By the war's end, an estimated 20 to 30 million people had died, making it one of the deadliest wars in history. Though the Qing eventually crushed the rebellion with foreign assistance, the cost was catastrophic. China was left weakened, its economy shattered, and its people devastated. The Taiping Rebellion exposed deep cracks in Chinese society and signaled the beginning of a turbulent century of upheaval. The American Civil War, fought between 1861 and 1865, remains the bloodiest conflict in United States history, fought between the Union in the North and the Confederacy in the South. The war's origins lay in deep divisions over slavery, states' rights, and the very question of national unity. When Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in April 1861, the crisis escalated into a full-scale war that would redefine the nation. The war featured iconic and devastating battles such as Gettysburg, Antietam, and Shiloh, each illustrating both the brutality of modern warfare and the extraordinary resilience of soldiers on both sides. Technological innovations like railroads, telegraphs, rifled muskets, and ironclad ships made it one of the first truly modern wars, reshaping tactics and amplifying destruction. Entire cities and regions were transformed into battlefields. By the time the war ended, more than 620,000 Americans had lost their lives, with some estimates pushing the toll closer to 750,000. Millions more were wounded or permanently displaced. Cities, railroads, and farmlands, particularly in the South, were left in ruins. The Emancipation Proclamation and eventual abolition of slavery marked turning points in U.S. history, yet the end of slavery did not erase racial tensions, which would persist for generations. The Civil War reshaped the nation's political and social identity, solidifying the Union, abolishing slavery, and laying the groundwork for Reconstruction. Its scars, however, ran deep, leaving behind bitterness, economic upheaval, and cultural divides that echoed far beyond the 19th century. The Korean War, fought between 1950 and 1953, often called the Forgotten War, was anything but insignificant in its scale and consequences. It began when North Korean forces, backed by the Soviet Union and China, launched a surprise invasion of South Korea. In response, the United Nations, led primarily by the United States, intervened to defend the South. The involvement of China, which sent massive numbers of troops into the conflict, ensured the war would drag on far longer than initially expected. North Korea's early advances nearly captured all of South Korea, but General Douglas MacArthur's daring amphibious landing at Incheon reversed the tide. However, when UN forces pushed close to the Chinese border, China launched a massive counteroffensive, driving the war back into stalemate along the 38th parallel. Harsh winters, mountainous terrain, and relentless fighting made conditions unbearable for soldiers and civilians alike. The human toll was staggering. Over 3 million Koreans, soldiers and civilians, lost their lives, while the United States suffered more than 36,000 deaths and nearly 100,000 wounded. China and North Korea endured hundreds of thousands of military casualties, and civilians faced massacres, famine, and separation from families that remain divided across the border to this day. Villages were obliterated, and infrastructure was left in ruins. The war ended not with peace, but with an armistice in July 1953, leaving the Korean peninsula divided along the demilitarized zone. The unresolved conflict left both sides entrenched, and the tensions it created still shape East Asian politics and global security in the 21st century. The Vietnam War, fought between 1955 and 1975, was one of the longest, most complex, and most divisive wars of the 20th century. At its core was the struggle between North Vietnam, backed by the Soviet Union and China, which sought to unify the nation under communism, and South Vietnam, supported heavily by the United States and its allies, determined to halt the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. The war was characterized by jungle warfare, guerrilla tactics, and relentless bombing campaigns. The Tet Offensive of 1968, a massive coordinated assault by North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces, shocked the American public by showing that victory was far from assured. Iconic images, from helicopters evacuating Saigon to the suffering of civilians caught in the crossfire, seared themselves into global memory and fueled growing anti-war sentiment. The human cost was catastrophic. More than 3 million Vietnamese died, including around 2 million civilians, while the United States lost over 58,000 soldiers, with hundreds of thousands more wounded. The conflict left behind widespread devastation, destroyed villages, poisoned landscapes from Agent Orange, and unexploded ordnance that still poses risks today. Neighboring countries like Cambodia and Laos also endured spillover violence and destabilization. The Vietnam War deeply divided American society, sparking massive protests, fracturing politics, and reshaping U.S. foreign policy. It marked a turning point in how wars were fought, reported, and perceived, with television bringing the realities of combat directly into homes. Its legacy endures in both Vietnam and the United States as a cautionary tale about intervention, the limits of military power, and the human cost of ideological conflict. The Crimean War, fought between 1853 and 1856, was one of the first major conflicts of the modern era, fought mainly between Russia and an alliance of Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire. The war stemmed from disputes over influence in the declining Ottoman Empire and Russia's ambitions to expand toward the Mediterranean. The war is best remembered for battles like the Siege of Sevastopol and the infamous Charge of the Light Brigade. These events, immortalized in poetry and reports, revealed the bravery and futility of war in equal measure. It also exposed the incompetence of military leadership and the staggering human cost of outdated tactics in an age of evolving weaponry. Casualties were devastating. Roughly 750,000 soldiers died, many not from combat, but from disease, poor sanitation, and lack of medical care. The horrors of the war spurred major reforms in military medicine, with figures like Florence Nightingale revolutionizing nursing and sanitary practices on the battlefield. The Crimean War reshaped European politics, weakening Russia while bolstering the Western alliance. It demonstrated the power of modern journalism and photography in shaping public opinion, marking it as not just a clash of empires, but also a war that changed how the world viewed conflict itself. The Peloponnesian War was a brutal conflict fought between Athens and its empire against Sparta and its Peloponnesian allies. What began as a rivalry for power in ancient Greece turned into a 27-year struggle that devastated the Greek world and ended the Golden Age of Athens. The war had two major phases, the Archidamian War and the Ionian War, with a fragile peace in between. Athens relied on its naval superiority, while Sparta excelled on land. However, the conflict was marked not just by pitched battles but by sieges, shifting alliances, and devastating plagues, including one that killed nearly a third of Athens's population. Key turning points included the disastrous Sicilian expedition, where Athens lost thousands of men and hundreds of ships. This colossal failure left Athens weakened and emboldened its enemies. Ultimately, Sparta, backed by Persian funding, built a navy strong enough to defeat Athens at sea. The Peloponnesian War ended with Athens' surrender in 404 BCE. The conflict left Greece fractured, paving the way for later domination by Macedon under Philip II and Alexander the Great. It remains one of history's starkest examples of how prolonged conflict can destroy even the most advanced civilizations. The French Wars of Religion, fought between 1562 and 1598, were a series of brutal conflicts between Catholics and Huguenots that tore France apart. At the heart of the wars was not only religion, but also political power struggles among noble families seeking dominance. The wars were marked by shocking acts of violence, including the infamous St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572, when thousands of Huguenots were slaughtered in Paris and across France. Religious fanaticism, vengeance, and distrust fueled cycles of bloodshed that devastated towns and villages for decades. Casualty estimates vary, but historians believe that as many as 3 million people may have died, not only from direct fighting, but also from famine and disease exacerbated by the conflict. The economic toll left France weakened and unstable, a nation torn apart by sectarian hatred. The wars eventually ended with the Edict of Nantes in 1598, issued by King Henry IV, which granted limited tolerance to Protestants and brought a fragile peace. While it offered temporary relief, the wars left lasting scars on French society, reminding future generations of the dangers of religious intolerance and political manipulation. The Russo-Japanese War, fought between 1904 and 1905, was a shocking conflict that defied global expectations at the time. For centuries, Russia had been seen as a dominant imperial power, while Japan was viewed as a rising but comparatively small nation. Yet when these two powers clashed over control of Korea and Manchuria, the world witnessed a stunning reversal. The war began with Japan's surprise attack on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur, echoing tactics that would later foreshadow Pearl Harbor. Japan demonstrated its ability to wage modern warfare with remarkable efficiency, particularly in its naval strength. Russia, meanwhile, was hampered by logistical problems, outdated strategies, and poor leadership. Major battles, such as the Battle of Mukden and the decisive naval clash at Tsushima, revealed Japan's growing power. The war cost hundreds of thousands of lives, with estimates of over 120,000 soldiers killed in action and many more wounded. The Treaty of Portsmouth, brokered by U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt, ended the war and granted Japan significant influence in East Asia. For the first time, an Asian power had defeated a major European empire in modern warfare. The impact of the Russo-Japanese War was immense. it destabilized Russia, fueling unrest that contributed to the 1905 revolution, while Japan's victory catapulted it into the ranks of global powers. This conflict shattered racial assumptions of the era and set the stage for future confrontations in the Pacific. The Syrian Civil War, which erupted in 2011, is one of the deadliest and most complex conflicts of the 21st century. Sparked by peaceful protests against President Bashar al-Assad during the Arab Spring, it quickly spiraled into a brutal multi-sided war involving the Syrian government, rebel factions, extremist groups, and foreign powers. What began as calls for political reform descended into mass bloodshed, with chemical weapons, barrel bombs, and sieges used against civilian populations. Cities such as Aleppo, Homs, and Raqqa became symbols of devastation, with entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble. The conflict drew in global players. Russia and Iran supported Assad, while the US and its allies backed certain rebel groups. Meanwhile, ISIS exploited the chaos to carve out territory. More than 500,000 people are estimated to have been killed, while millions were displaced internally or fled abroad, creating one of the largest refugee crises in modern history. The war also left behind immense cultural destruction, with ancient heritage sites obliterated. Over a decade later, Syria remains fractured. The Assad regime still clings to power, but vast regions remain unstable. The Syrian civil war has reshaped global politics, demonstrating the devastating consequences of failed states and international rivalries, while leaving scars that will last for generations. The Soviet-Afghan War was a bloody Cold War battleground that transformed Afghanistan into a symbol of resistance and tragedy. In December 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to prop up a communist government facing rebellion. The intervention sparked a fierce insurgency led by Afghan Mujahideen fighters, supported by the United States, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and other nations. The war was fought in Afghanistan's harsh terrain, where guerrilla fighters used ambushes, sabotage, and intimate knowledge of the mountains to challenge the Soviet military. The Mujahideen were armed with advanced weaponry, most notably US-supplied Stinger missiles, which devastated Soviet aircraft. Estimates suggest that up to 2 million Afghans died, millions more fled as refugees, and entire villages were destroyed. For the Afghan people, the conflict left behind deep scars, destroyed infrastructure, and a destabilized society. The Soviet withdrawal in 1989 was seen as a humiliating defeat and contributed to the eventual collapse of the USSR. However, the war also left Afghanistan in chaos, paving the way for civil war and the eventual rise of the Taliban. The Afghan War's legacy continues to shape global politics as its consequences rippled far beyond its borders, influencing conflicts well into the 21st century. These wars reshaped nations and cost millions of lives. Which war do you think was the most devastating in history? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more history's greatest and darkest stories explained.